there are certain subtypes of doshas or constitutions that you can say out the gate, hey, you're probably not going to be a responder to this neurochemical modulator, this SSRI, or even this antibiotic or this anesthetic. And so we can see very, very rapidly the value of integrating these parallel pattern recognition systems into a Western practice.
Some lesser known Ayurvedic herbs. What are you loving right now?
I'll bring up some secret formula here. How about that?
Oh,
The high yield stuff. The stuff
Please.
people are going to go, oh my gosh.
Yeah.
If people haven't played with
Hello and welcome back to the Vibrant Wellness Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Emmie Brown, here with our wonderful co-host, Melissa Gentile. Today, we're going to mix it up a little bit and try something new and start off with a question for the audience. Are you looking for new tools or strategies to combat HPA axis dysfunction, menopause? What about Hashimoto's? Are you curious about how Ayurveda and functional medicine can help? Today, we're honored to have the opportunity to learn about this unique approach to supporting hormonal health with Dr. Neela Sandal. Dr. Sandal is the founder and director of Atma Clinic. He is a family medicine physician who completed his residency at the University of Arizona, where he collaborated with leaders in integrative and functional medicine through the Andrew Weil Center for Integrative Medicine. At his clinic, Atma Clinic, Dr. Sandal integrates various healing modalities, including Ayurveda, herbalism, energy healing, and yoga with contemporary scientific research to develop individualized treatment plans for hormone optimization, autoimmune disease, biotoxicity, mental and spiritual health, and more. We cannot wait to learn more about hormone balancing using Ayurveda with Dr. Sandal. Thanks so much for being here.
Emmie, thank you. And Melissa, thank you. It's great to be here. I'm excited to have a cool conversation.
Yes, something I read on your site, Dr. Sandal, that I just loved. You mentioned it's not uncommon to hear your patients say, Doc, I just got back from Mayo and they couldn't even figure it out.
I initially started saying that almost as a joke, and then, somehow our thoughts manifest reality, right? And that is literally the most common thing that walked my door now is that exact statement. And it's either Mayo or Cleveland,
Yeah.
But
Yeah. So I'm curious to kick it off here. Can you share a bit about one of your favorite complicated cases and the pearls you learned from going through that experience?
one of the things that I really, really like doing is I like trying to innovate new tools for patients who have been turned away by the conventional community or even by the functional community.
Yeah.
We're all trying to build technology essentially to figure out, well, how do we do better for our patients? And what I really like doing the most is personalizing that. I am very much a personal physician. People come to my door and they say, hey, doc, I was just at another functional medicine clinic and I've done acupuncture and I was at Mayo and I'm all out of luck. What am I missing? What do we need to do here? And what I really enjoy is just really getting into the nitty gritty of what makes that person bio-individual. This is one of my initial interests in Ayurveda was that in Ayurveda, and this is true of traditional Chinese medicine as well, they start from the position of people having different subtypes. There are different constitutional types. And that's very much a step in the right direction. I think everyone in functional medicine and integrative medicine is trying to figure out how do we get away from statistical medicine and how do we get over to personal medicine. And these Eastern medical practices have already kind of crossed that chasm a little bit. They're already trying to break people down into different types. And this can actually inform our Western medical practices in an enormous fashion. So, for instance, there are certain subtypes of doshas or constitutions that you can say out the gate, hey, you're probably not going to be a responder to this neurochemical modulator, this SSRI, or even this antibiotic or this anesthetic. And so we can see very, very rapidly the value of integrating these parallel pattern recognition systems into a Western practice. And so as far as, patient cases that come in the door, every single patient who comes in is unique. And I've had stuff as diverse as Behçet's syndrome to ALS, to, there's all, of course there's leaky guts and there's anxiety and depression and there's the whole gamut. I'm happy to say that the approach that we use at Atma Clinic really has given a lot of people hope when they'd been everywhere else. To kind of go back to something I brought up earlier, we had a case, for instance, of Behçet's. Behçet's is a complicated, rare autoimmune disorder affecting the entirety of the GI tract. And really, it's incredibly miserable. It leads to massive ulceration diffusely across mucosa, stem to stern, the whole bit. And it's truly miserable. And this had been a case like many others that had been, everywhere trying to figure something out. And as usually happens, they end up on a lot of things to try and maintain the illness or manage the illness. And so this person was on heavy doses of biologics to just turn down the immune system. And, of course, that's, better than nothing. Absolutely. There's good value in that. But of course, it's not perfect, right? It's not great. It's like, okay, I love that you don't have ulcers everywhere, but now you have this biologic, which one is very expensive, two, you're dependent on it, and three, it has an enormous amount of side effects, right? The sort of long-term effects on cancer, oncogenesis and those sort of things with biologics is
Not
important.
great. Mm,
And yeah, right.
no.
And so we were able to basically go back to, as I describe it, back down to foundations. Why has their, if you will, cellular intelligence misfire? And this is actually a term or an idea directly from Ayurveda. There's this Sanskrit term, tehas, which translates to radiance. And it's described that the sun has an intelligence that radiates from it, that we experience as light. And actually, our cells have the same thing. There's, of course, the Western study of biophotonics, which is just really starting to look at that exact same thing. What they knew for millennia in India, they're like, oh, there's something there, right? And so we took this patient and we just went back down to foundations, trying to figure out, why is there a misfire? And then trying to build for that individual from the ground up. And we actually have full remission of Behçet's. And again, classic case, she's been to Mayo. They go, I don't know, good luck, sorry. And we just happen to see that all the time. And I really credit thinking about homeostasis in a deeper way as why we're able to accomplish that. We're really trusting the body's ability to adapt and maintain itself. We just sometimes have to get stuff out of the way, or we have to add something in.
We had someone on the podcast recently that kind of said, a similar phrase here that said, the body will heal itself. We just have to remove all of the blockers and kind of let it do its thing. And we're overcomplicating it with all the different crazy other modalities that we have out there. So I'm super excited to dive into Ayurveda specifically.
Yeah, it's tempting, right? In the West, we have this reductionist philosophy. We're like, well, we're going to take really complicated systems and we're going to chop them into 1,000 bits. And then I'm going to design tools to measure each of those 1,000 things, to quantify them. And that will tell me what's going on. I think in a real sense, that's where functional medicine is in a big way. And that's good, right? There's nothing wrong with that. But the problem with that is that you only see those 1,000 different things. Well, the human body is not just, X number of things. There is so much in between and interconnected between those things. And so it's very challenging to try and quantify it in a useful way. We'll talk about hormones and we'll get into this more later, but I think a lot of practitioners, for instance, who do bioidentical hormone replacement therapy, they're like, well, yeah, we can, measure your urinary or salivary hormone level. But actually what we're really going to base your dose titration on is clinical results.
Right.
Well, why is that? It's because what we care about is the integrated person, not the quantitative pieces. Those are hints, those are clues, they can be useful. So yeah, we have to just keep on pushing into the deeper layers of these.
Right. And this is a really good time to bring up the fact that Ayurveda does have the doshas. And I want you to talk more about this, Dr. Sandal, but how does that relate to that clinical assessment for our hormonal concerns, such as menopause, for example, and how does that guide therapy?
I think probably the most important thing to say about Ayurveda, the most useful frame when we're comparing Western approaches to Ayurveda, and this is also true of Chinese medicine as well, is that in the Eastern systems, fundamentally, we are a tripartite entity. We are three parts. We are a physical body, we are a subtle or mental or astral body, and we are a spiritual body. And those things are not separable.
Mm-hmm.
This is actually the meaning behind Atma. The name of my clinic, Atma Clinic,
Oh,
is
yeah,
the
that's what
Sanskrit
you
I
word for
remember
said.
the
the story.
total
Yeah.
person. And this is a really, really useful way to think about things. Fundamentally, when we do any work in TCM or Ayurveda, we're thinking about the total person. And again, it's kind of like what I was just talking about. We have to resist the impulse to break people down into quantifiable chunks. That's actually kind of an intellectual shortcut that we do as physicians that isn't exactly reality. It's just our dogma.
Mm-hmm.
And so the doshas are this type of subtyping, constitutional subtyping. And there are three primary doshas, which are the result of the elements of nature. And we have the energies, if you will, of wind and ether, called vata. We have the energies of fire and water, called pitta. And we have the combined energies of water again and earth, called kapha. And the idea is that all of these elements fundamentally create us. Now, going back to what I was saying earlier, it's not just a physical thing. It's not like, okay, well, yeah, I'm made of, earth, wind, fire, water. It's also that these doshas, because they are intrinsic to reality around us, we are just condensations of that, if you will. It also affects our mental state. And I think that maybe for my peers in functional medicine, that is the thing that I would really, really recommend they look into for Ayurveda, is the fact that when we talk about things like the gut-brain connection or the mind-body connection, Ayurveda throws that out. It's like, no, there's no connection. They are the same thing.
I like that. Yeah.
And so when we're thinking about doshas and constitutions, we're thinking about the physicality, but also the way that people interact with reality, the way that they filter reality, their lenses. And so it's a very different way of looking at the world, but we're looking, of course, at the same thing, whether we're using Western chemistry or we're using Ayurvedic dosha typing, we're using sort of parallel pattern recognition systems to look at the same thing. And of course, if you look at one object from two different perspectives, you see more of that object, which is what I really think the deep value is.
There's a lot to take in there. And I'm just thinking about, and when I love it, I love how you say that the gut-brain connection is something maybe we need to question and say, no, we need to understand that they are one and the same, right? And so it's always refreshing to get a new thought process on this podcast, Dr. Sandal. So I so appreciate that. And I'm wondering, are there particular doshas associated with specific hormonal disorders? Does it work that way? Do you see Hashimoto's more so in Pitta? That's the first one I can remember, Pitta dosha or XYZ dosha.
Yeah, definitely. And before I answer that question, I'm going to take one step back to add in another foundational concept in Ayurveda that will make this answer make a lot more sense to me, a lot more useful to me. Yes, the doshas affect our health, but Ayurveda and TCM are all fundamentally about balance. It's about, hey, where am I supposed to be versus where am I? And so when we think about certain doshas causing or correlating well with things like hypothyroidism or hypogonadism or chronic fatigue or autoimmune disease, what we're really thinking about is we're thinking about imbalance. Okay, where is this person's innate constitution, their so-called prakriti, and where is their constitutional state right now, their vikruti? And someone may, at the point of conception, Ayurvedists say this is determined based on their prior karma. At the point of conception, someone's base constitution is established. And let's say that someone is primarily pitta, secondarily vata, tertiarily kapha, rank order. And let's say they are working, they're working a shift job. They have to shift work. Let's say they're a medical resident, and they're having to go out on call and
No, the crazy.
So someone might have this constitution, and all of that shift work is inherently vatic. It's very vata exacerbating. Not having routine is very windy or airy. We get whipped up. It's like standing on a mountaintop and you're just getting blown at. It's very harsh. And so, yeah, you could get that from wind, literally, but there are also all sorts of different habits and, herbs and toxins and things that can give you that windiness, if you will. And so you have someone who has this prakriti, and then you give them a bunch of vata, and their vikruti gets pulled off into what I would describe as vata exacerbation. So when we look at something like hypothyroidism, back to your point, I would describe that people who have hypothyroidism usually are experiencing vata exacerbation. Not just vata, because vata can be okay, but it's a question of balance.
Too
So
much.
they have too much vata.
So they would need to bring in probably some other elements of the other doshas, whether that's through food or their environment or their lifestyle or schedule or et cetera. It's kind of
Yeah,
like a balance
100% correct,
that?
Melissa.
Okay. I know a little bit about Ayurveda, not very much, but I've just
Yeah.
started to begin my studies in it. So I'm starting to understand because I can definitely relate to that vata exacerbation.
Yeah. I think in the US, we have a very vata oriented culture. There's a lot of irregularity.
Mhm.
We all, especially as professionals, we all just, get the job done. But that leads to a lot of irregularity, suppression of natural urges like, hey, I'm hungry. Oh, I'll get to it later after I see 2 more patients.
Mm.
And the body just goes, that's not very robust. That's not giving me vitality. And so what then happens if you have, let's say, vata exacerbation is that extra, if you will, windiness then causes irritation to the tissues called dhatus.
Mm.
And if we have wearing down, if you will, erosion of those tissues, then we have the manifestation of illness.
Mm. So if someone is dealing with some kind of hormonal imbalance, um, if I'm grasping this correctly, it could be from different imbalances from different patients. So let's say 3 patients have the same issue. Maybe it's estrogen dominance, or maybe they're having something going on with blood sugar, insulin, but they could have very different primary doshas and different issues going on. It's kind of like not all the same across the board. So for someone listening in right now, and let's say they're going through some kind of hormonal imbalance, what can they do from an Ayurvedic perspective to start assessing that issue?
hmm Um, one of the really cool things about Ayurveda is that it's accessible to lay people almost as easily as it is to us professionals.
Mhm.
A lot of our medical dogma right now is like, let's say that I want to evaluate someone's urinary hormones to
Mhm.
answer your question. Let's say I'm taking a purely functional or Western approach.
Mhm.
What has to happen? Well, I have to go to a company and, do a Dutch test or maybe use LabCorp if we're really kind of trying to be simple on things. And I have to have prescriptive authority to write that, right? Like there's a barrier that the layperson can't gather their own data. They have to come through somebody else.
Yeah.
But the reality is that the people who are the nearest to the experience of health or lack thereof is the individual patient.
Mm.
They actually have the most opportunity to understand what's going on with themselves. They just need to be empowered, equipped with the information. And so Ayurveda never really got into the process of quantifying things quite as neurotically as we do. Not to say that that's a bad thing. It's a useful tool. But this is to say that if someone is saying, hey, I'm imbalanced, from Ayurvedic perspective, they're actually fairly well equipped to answer the questions about that themselves.
Oh, that's
Well,
fascinating.
yeah. So imagine it, okay, why am I imbalanced? What doesn't feel right about my biology right now or my mental state right now?
Mm.
We check in. It can be a little challenging for people because we have such a go, go, go externalization culture. But this is a tool available to everybody. Everybody can stop and go, okay, I'm on a podcast. We're talking about interesting topics. I'm a little excitable. I'm feeling this sort of rev up. Okay, what does that do to me? right? And so we stop and we check in, we actually get an enormous amount of information about what's going on. So to go back to that example, what's happening? Well, I'm having elevation of my pitta, my solar energy, if you will, because I'm trying to be on point. I want to be impressive, right? And if that was something that persisted, if I got stuck in that, then one can imagine how that starts to become irritating to the biology. We can't always be in sympathetic state, right?
It feels
Pretty
like we
quickly we
all
start
are.
to,
Yeah.
yeah, we start to
Right.
burn out,
Mhm.
right? The energy of fire. We even have nomenclature that fits neatly. So if someone is saying, hey, I'm a little feeling hormonally imbalanced. Let's use a typical example. Let's say that a young lady is saying, well, hey, my menses just became a little irregular. Yeah, I've been regular for a long time. This month I'm a little irregular. Last month, I was a little irregular. What is going on with this? Well, the first thing that I would advise a patient to do, and sometimes, of course, we'll help them with this by going through the history taking, which is really reflective. You tell me, what about this? What do you think about this? And it's not uncommon that people will ascribe some stressors. Like, well, I just had a breakup, or I got, my job was really stressful. I just had a bunch of projects dropped on my lap. And it's like, okay, well, that's a pretty darn good lead. How do you feel about that? Do you feel like that could be causative? Right. And it's like, well, yeah, maybe, and it's like, okay, well, what can we do about that? And of course, we could use functional medicine tools for that. We could use Ayurvedic herbs. We could use nutraceutical precursors. But remembering that the mind and the body are not separate things, the lifestyle or mental intervention is often more powerful than all of that. We can give someone herbs, adrenal adaptogens for stress, pregnenolone, DHEA. I mean, there's all sorts of stuff we can get into. But really, if that person is able to identify, okay, why is this happening for me? I can't really cover up with, let's say, some ashwagandha, the fact that they just had a breakup and they have grief they're processing.
Yeah.
Well, that's actually more to the point. Let's talk about that. And let's help you develop a practice where you can get rid of that heat, that intensity. And of course, we can all see how pretty quickly then the menses normalize. And, everyone's unique. Sometimes we swing and we miss, or we go, okay, well, let's get the Dutch test. What are we missing? We can dig in. But I really do like that this keeps the patient primarily in the driver's seat.
I think that the counseling aspect for functional medicine practitioners and all practitioners for that matter can be maybe intimidating. It's something that a lot of us say we didn't go to school for. And yet so many of our patients really, really benefit from that. And that practice of getting them to be self-aware, as you just walked us through. So what would you say to providers listening, as far as training and counseling techniques? Do you recommend that they refer or have somebody on your team in terms of that counseling aspect? How do you approach it?
Mm. Um, First of all, I think that it's not really as daunting as people fear.
Mm.
There's nothing magic about it. There's nothing that they teach you when you're getting a PhD in psychology that is fundamentally unknown to healers of all stripes.
Yeah.
If you are a naturopath, if you're an MD, if you're a DO, if you're a nutritional therapist, whatever, you're used to interacting with patients. You're used to listening to them. There's no magic. In fact, most counseling is just a matter of experience.
Mm.
And so I would really just encourage my peers, try it. First and foremost, listen. Zip it, let them talk, ask some questions. And mostly we're just trying to reflect. We don't have to have the answer for them. In fact, we usually won't unless we have some moment of inspiration. Really, all we're trying to do is we're trying to help them see themselves. And they're the ones who are good at that. We just have to convince them that they are good at it.
I think that's where that empowerment piece kind of comes from. I think that's kind of forgotten in the functional medicine space because I think sometimes, I'm not saying all practitioners, but sometimes in the functional and integrative space, the power gets placed more on the provider and the patient's really looking to the provider for the answers. And we're kind of reversing that, which I love. I think we need more of that in our world. And as a nutritionist, I have to ask and get into nutrition and an Ayurvedic approach. Because from what I understand, foods can have different energy or be tied to a different dosha. And how can we bring in nutrition into kind of this healing piece when it comes to like imbalances within the doshas?
Yeah, it's a great question. Food is a really, really good tool, right? Hippocrates had this idea that food should be our medicine.
Mm.
And I think in the West, we're all kind of like, oh, nutrients. Okay, cool. In Ayurveda, they think about that very, very literally. And there's some very straightforward examples. Let's say that someone is having irregularity in their schedule. So they're having a vata exacerbation.
Hmm.
We can balance that out by adding in more kapha. Now, what does that mean? Well, it can mean a ton of different things. We could change our patterns. We could take herbs. We could take some nutraceuticals. But most fundamentally, most kind of excessively, if you will, we could just eat some kapha foods. And actually, I think people really understand this on an unconscious level, and they actually do it themselves unconsciously. Like, let's say that you just got off a nasty shift and you're stressed out. What do you want to do? Well, people want to have some ice cream or a potato chip. They're like, let me get something fatty and thick and something I can just, really enjoy myself with. That's a very Copic experience. And so the body is very intelligent. It naturally balances these things out. And, and then we get all complicated and we're like, oh, well, maybe ice cream has too much sugar and all this. Well, yeah, for some people in some circumstances, though, those things are super appropriate. So absolutely, food is literally medicine in Ayurveda because it's balancing. We just have to be intelligent about not leaning accidentally into our exacerbations, but rather trying to bring those back. And so that takes some awareness. That takes some self-diagnostics, if you will.
Mm. Does this also tie into the seasons as well? Just kind of like, I personally live in environment. I experience all 4 seasons here, and it's like my cravings and appetite changes so much through the winter seasons. I just like want broths and warm soups and things like that. Maybe because there's that wind factor and it's cold and everything, and kind of vice versa.
Absolutely.
Whereas in the spring, I know it is. This is interesting too, just because the time of year it is. Because right now it's January 8th and we're recording. Everyone's on their detox juice cleanses, but in this practice, this is not a cleansing time, correct? First thing in
Correct.
January, it's more in the springtime.
Yeah, absolutely correct. And so we all kind of get these dogmas,
Mm.
right? And we're like, I don't know, New Year's, let's do a juice fast. And it's like, that's really leaning into the potential for vata exacerbation with the cold and
Yeah.
the wind.
Mm.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're spot on with that. Yeah, right now we just got a massive snowstorm.
Same.
We were only able just to dig ourselves out today after like 5 days.
Yeah.
And there's a feeling that happens with that. Our body naturally has a call to be warm and cozy. I want to sit by the fireplace. I want to take a nap. I want to read a book. I'm not trying to do anything too adventurous other than maybe go sledding with the kids. Our body knows these things. We get called to it. We just, I think in the West, are very used to ignoring those signals accidentally.
You mentioned cravings, Melissa, and I want to go back to that,
Yeah.
Dr. Sandal, because I don't know that would you use that word, and maybe there is this perspective that if we are self-aware in this way, as far as knowing how to balance out the doshas, maybe giving into a craving, and I don't even want to word it that way. I think there's some guilt there, but being able to judiciously honor our cravings, maybe is that? Am I thinking correctly in that way?
Yeah. And I would even go further. I would say, craving is not a dirty word.
Yeah, I love that.
often tell
That could
my,
be a slogan.
what's that?
It could be a slogan. It should be a slogan. That craving is not a dirty word.
I
Oftentimes
love
we
it.
feel that it is in this culture, this, diet culture.
Right. Which is a kind of an unusual dogma, or it's kind of a transgressive dogma. It is um, we don't trust ourselves sort of
Mhm.
idea. And I'll often tell my patients, our body is actually incredibly refined and able to give us signals about what we need. We just have to listen. And also, I give the big caveat that regarding sugars and wheat, that can be a perverse craving. That is kind of my only carve out. I will always give that warning. If I'm saying, hey, I want you to listen to your body, and they're like, hey, I just want to eat a bunch of, candy. I'm like, and also,
Yes.
yeast
There's a
can
caveat.
hijack your psychology in important ways. So that is important to keep in mind. It is possible for cravings to come from a point of exacerbation. I
Mhm.
mostly see this with people who are stuck in habits. Someone who is, let's say, maybe prone to anger, and they see that, but they really can't get out of it. That is a pitta exacerbation feeding a pitta exacerbation. We can accidentally kind of just get dragged along with that. And so it does take some careful thinking. People have to make the choice. Hey, what is my body asking me to do? Is it asking me to be relaxed and let this go? Or is it asking me to fight? And we
Mm.
have to stop. We have to really think about what the body's telling us. And then we can move with some intelligence. With food cravings, I think it's oftentimes a lot easier. Um, Even from a Western perspective, I'll give the example, you know, when we think about the sort of classic couch potato, it's like someone who just like lays on the couch and they're eating potato chips. It's like, well, what are they doing? From a functional medicine perspective, from a Western biochemical perspective, what they're doing is they're self-medicating their adrenal fatigue.
Yeah.
Mm.
And what are the rate limiting nutrients for adrenal glandular growth? Minerals,
Salt.
right?
Yeah.
Salt, fats,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so they get it. They're like, oh, this is going to make me feel better. And it does.
Yeah.
And so we have to make sure that we're kind of taking all medications in dosing. It doesn't mean that we then stop paying attention. We just eat, a bag of chip and then start another one. It's like, okay, I ate, a half a bag of chips. How do I feel? Starting to feel kind of sluggish. Okay, we're probably good. We have enough kappa, right? Now get up and do something.
Right. Do you have patients journal how they're feeling as they're learning about themselves in this way?
Yeah, that's a great question, Emmy. Um, I don't think it's a bad idea. I will say though, I often find journaling, it takes a special sort of person to benefit from journaling.
Ah, okay. Yeah.
I think a lot of patients hear journaling and they want to run away.
Yeah.
They're shutting you
Yeah.
They're
down.
kind of like, ah. And I get it. Like, I'm not really into that myself, but journaling can be a tool to self-awareness.
Hmm.
Everyone must practice self-awareness. I don't really care how it happens. If journaling is the thing, great. Get yourself a really nice journal, get yourself a nice pen, good tactile experience, get into it. But also meditation practice is really in one sense the same. I think journaling can be sometimes a little too detail oriented. So people they get kind of in a position where they're paying attention to the trees rather than the forest.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great way of kind of painting that picture. And everybody's going to be different in terms of how they tap into that self-awareness. And it might just be a walk outside. It might just be,
Yeah.
watching the sunset or the sunrise or movement. I wonder about movement also. That's a very
Mhm.
mindful practice for myself.
And of course, there's different types of movement, right? There's
Mhm.
a relaxing walk outside and there's a vigorous hill sprint.
Yes.
Mm.
Right. And so you can take one intervention, let's say movement, and then you can have a Vatic, Pitic, or Copic version of that.
Mm.
Gotcha. That makes that makes a lot of sense. I feel like I've gone through phases where it's like lots of HIIT classes, sprints, and intense weight training sessions. But like the last year, it's like all I want to do is be in a yin yoga class and walk
Yeah.
outside. Like
Yeah.
nothing, I feel horrible when I like do these really intense classes, but I know that that could just be cyclical too. That might, there might be another time where intense training might serve me well in another phase, maybe when another dosha is, kind of
And so,
becoming the forefront.
yeah.
Mhm.
And so knowing what we know about Ayurveda, we can deduce that during that same period of time, the intensity in your life has gone up a lot. That's why you're balancing that. And so there's all this information hidden around the edges that the people will tell us if we listen, right?
Mm. Yeah, exactly. And when you say to patients who are skeptical of these concepts, if they've never heard of this modality and philosophy before, and they're coming from Cleveland Clinic or Mayo Clinic, and they've seen test results, they've done all these supplements, they've done medications, they've done all these different protocols, and they come to you and they're like, what do you mean I need more kapha in my life? They're just like, it's not registering for them. How do you kind of walk them through that perspective and get them to adopt?
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, we don't need them to adopt.
Okay.
I'm happy to work with a person in whatever way is empowering to them. I am, a Western trained MD. And so I can just use that. I can just lean into that and use that language. but I'm going to let the concepts of Ayurveda inform the way in which I do that.
Gotcha. Yeah, I like that perspective. So you're still kind of communicating in a way that they are familiar and makes more sense.
Right.
Gotcha.
Right. And other people, they're looking for something new. And they're like,
Mhm.
I'm tired of people getting labs on me and telling me that my DHEA is suboptimal and
Mhm.
my lipids are, and you're like, okay, pause on that. Let's pull back and put you in the driver's seat in a way that empowers you.
Are you waiting to run functional medicine labs, Dr. Sandal, until maybe you do a trial of a certain therapy or mindfulness practice with a patient? Or, I mean, I'm sure it depends on the case, but I'm curious kind of how do you approach labs when you do run labs?
hmm Um, yeah, you're exactly right. It really does depend on the individual. So the way that my practice works and the way that I teach other physicians and nurse practitioners to practice is when we're meeting someone again, we want it to be personal. We want it to be personalized. They're not a statistic. It's not, 80% of people get a benefit from X, Y, and Z. It's like, no, no, no. What is going to work for this person? So the first thing we do is a lot of data gathering. And really that's mostly exam and history. Every physician knows that we get most of our information from talking to our patients and
Yes.
listening. And so I always start there. All my patients who come into Atma Clinic, they're going to spend an hour one-on-one after really, I'm sure all functional medicine practitioners are used to, of having them do an exhaustive intake packet. And we're just really playing Sherlock Holmes. We're really listening. We want to be a detective and understand what's going on. I will usually then take all of that information and just meditate on it. I'll have them come back in a week and I'll present them with a personalized treatment plan. I'll say, hey, here's all the options. Here's how I think we should approach this. And you're exactly right. For some people, they don't want to see the data. Maybe they don't want to spend the money on the data. Maybe they're tired of the data. Maybe they don't believe in the data. Maybe they've been burned. And so we might lead with other lifestyle interventions. But I will say that just about everybody ends up using an admixture of those two. There's a lot of strength in functional medicine and the quantified data, but I just don't want other practitioners to miss the forest for the trees. The data is useful, but it should inform the bigger clinical picture.
Of
So
course.
I really do like to do both.
It's a piece of the puzzle. That's something I'm always talking to practitioners about is that we want to treat the patient, not the numbers, but the numbers can help guide us.
Yep.
So we want to use them to our advantage, but it's just a piece. So, and with that, I'm curious, do you notice any patterns on the labs that you are running on your patients that maybe
Oh yeah.
correspond with doshas?
It's
Love
fascinating.
to know this. Yeah.
Yeah. There is so much to be said about this topic.
Oh, I can't wait. Well,
Um,
we've got some more time, so
so, so when again, I said earlier in our conversation, when we look at an object, we're just trying to understand what the object is. And we come at it from one perspective and we come at it from another perspective. And the more perspectives from which we view that object, the more we can understand not just a representation of reality, but increasingly actually what is the reality,
mhm.
right? There's that old parable about the blind men trying to identify the elephant. Have you guys heard that?
I don't know if I
So
have.
there's four blind men
Okay.
and someone's like, hey, I want you to feel this thing and tell me what you're feeling.
Mhm.
And one of the blind men is touching the trunk of the elephant. And they're like, that's like a hose or something. And one of the blind men is touching the leg and hoof of the elephant. And I'm pretty sure it's a tree. Someone else is touching the tail. And they're like, it's I don't know, a whisk. It's some strings. And so individually, they're all confused about what it is. But when you add those together, you're like, okay, well, hang on. What has a hose and a tree trunk at one point? What has a whisk-like structure? And all of a sudden you start to say, oh, are these guys talking about an elephant? Right. And so similarly, all of the data gathering that we're doing, that any good practitioner is doing, regardless of tool, is they're just trying to kind of triangulate to understand what's actually going on.
Mhm.
And so to get to your question on seeing patterns, yeah, absolutely. I actually will have many patients nowadays on whom I do not feel the need to order labs because from a doshic analysis, I know what the labs are going to show me. Absolutely.
Mhm.
And I'm actually, I'm a scientist by trade, right? And so I've tested myself with this. I'm always telling my patients, be skeptical. Be skeptical of what I tell you. Be skeptical of what another physician tells you. I'm skeptical of what I think. And that's how we grow as scientists, right? And so I'm like, okay, I'm pretty sure I can tell just from the history here that this person is going to have a cortisol dysregulation.
Mm-hmm.
They have type 2 adrenal hyperregulation. And I could do a test, but a lot of times I'm looking at that going, I don't know if we really need to spend the money or the time on that. We should probably just move empirically with some therapy.
Yeah.
Because it's pretty clear what's going on. And what I find really nice is I'm able to walk patients through that and ask them, I'm like, well, what do you want? Do you feel like the quantified data is going to make you feel more confident? Or do you feel what I'm telling you and that that's really where we need to go anyway?
Mm.
And honestly, 70% of the time they're like, yeah, let's just, get me some ashwagandha, some rhodiola, some chandra. Let's mix in some ginseng and let's see where we go with it. So yeah, there's a ton of stuff like that. Looking at HSCRPs, looking at autoimmune profiles, looking at Vibrance neurozoomers, gut zoomers. And I really, really love all of that data. And I think it's important for people to train themselves on that data. I love that we have access to those things. Those are really, really super useful for us being able to hand to heart say, hey, I'm practicing science. But we do start to see a lot of commonalities, a lot of trends.
Sure. And the data incentivizes the right patient depending on what drives them. I think that's very valuable.
And also to use, let's say, maybe the neurozoomer as a good example of kind of what I would describe as a fine-tooth comb of a test. We're really looking for the minutia. I think there's a lot to be said about using that refined data as a proactive measure of trying to say like, hey, what direction are we heading in here? It hasn't manifested itself into your tissues yet, but where are we likely going? Okay, this is sub-perceptual. The data actually is very valuable for that longevity and optimization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, prevention is really key for a lot of our patients in our practices. Well, we're coming up on the hour, Dr. Sandal, but I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about your favorite Ayurvedic herbs for balancing hormones. You mentioned already you threw out ashwagandha. I love rhodiola. I think about rhodiola as the kind of rose-colored glasses. If we're thinking about someone who has a gloomy outlook, maybe some depression plaguing them, but maybe some lesser-known Ayurvedic herbs. What are you loving right now?
Yeah. I'll bring up some secret formula here. How about that? The high yield stuff. The stuff people are going to go, oh my gosh. If people haven't played with Shilajit, also called Shilajit,
my favorite,
I highly recommend looking at this.
Yeah.
Shilajit is an absolutely fascinating substance. Shilajit fundamentally is a type of resin that is historically extracted out of the Himalaya mountains. It is important to find a good source for it. Just like a lot of things from India and China, there's a lot of rip-off stuff and people will cut it with toxic junk. And you have to be actually quite careful about it. Of course, you really want a third-party analysis on any supplement you're using, right?
Sure.
But Shilajit is the Sanskrit translation of Shilajit is rock invincible.
Wow.
I think it's also known as the destroyer of weakness. I've heard that one. Yeah.
Right.
Powerful.
It is phenomenal. It's actually truly powerful. And in reality, we don't fully know actually what is all in that. But it is primarily a really dense source of fulvic and humic minerals, probably mixed amino acids, and there may be some herbal compounds in there that we haven't really identified yet. The net effect of this is that it builds tissue. Now, that doesn't mean it makes you fat. It means that it takes all of the different dhatus or tissues and bulletproofs them, makes them rock invincible. And it's often quite compelling. For instance, if you have an athlete and they start taking Shilajit, they are going to notice in a week gains in their athletic performance. It is very, very potent. It does come with a caveat. Shilajit is strictly contraindicated for people who have leaky gut in Ayurveda, they would think about that as ama, or gut toxicity, or sort of biome irregularity that ends up with coat on the tongue. So if someone's guts are touchy, Shila Jatu feeds everything, including your biome. So if your biome is disordered, Shila Jatu can really throw that off. So you have to be careful about that.
Oh, I didn't know.
But yeah, but for everybody else, Shilajit is potent stuff. If you want to really increase, for instance, testosterone, a combination of Shilajit and ashwagandha is phenomenal. You added some Tongkat Ali to boot. I mean, I've seen testosterone go up 400 points total T. They can be rapid. And people will feel it. People will go, whoa, that was too much. Like my wife is angry at me because I keep on bugging her. It's like, it can be very, very potent. And it works for women as well, again, for athletic performance. So Shilajit is a hidden gem for sure.
Yeah, I've been on it for like 4 or 5 years now. I think
Wow.
not like consistently every single day, but that's interesting. I have not heard that note about the gut dysbiosis and the resin as well, because I'm actually on a gut protocol right now and I'm still taking it. So maybe I should, put it on pause. So learn
So
something new
long
every
as
day, right?
you just don't want to be robbing Peter to pay Paul. If you're working on your guts and you're like, oh,
Yeah.
well, this thing is irritating my gut. It's
Mhm.
not necessarily true that it'll do that, but a classic example is SIBO. SIBO will just blow up if you give someone Shilajit.
Oh, wow.
So it
Is
could be a
that
big
because,
little diagnostic in that way too for SIBO. Huh.
Absolutely.
so it's literally feeding the pathogenic microbes? Is that what's going on? Like how
It
exactly?
feeds everything.
Everything. Okay. So if you have a
Yeah,
really healthy microbiome, this is amazing for it. But it's like if you got
absolutely.
parasites and candida and all this other stuff going on, not a good time to throw it in there. Gotcha. Awesome. Well, thank you, Dr. Sandal, so much. You brought so much into this episode today. We haven't really been able to dive super deep on Ayurveda and really bring in this perspective. I like that we focus so much on how we can kind of use this to assess a patient and really empower a patient, because I think that's such a missing piece in the functional community, in the integrative space. So I'm really happy for this episode to go live, and I think our listeners are going to take so much from it. And if anyone resonated with your messaging and your teachings today, where can we find you online?
So we're building a YouTube right now. It's the
Yay.
Atma MD on
Mhm.
YouTube. Check it out. Yeah, we're just
Awesome.
kind of trying to figure out what sort of content resonates with people.
Mhm.
Obviously, there's all sorts of fun stuff to talk about. So if any of our listeners wants to connect or talk about these things, find us there. Drop us some comments, and I can build some videos bespoke to interesting topics that people have. So yeah, we're just starting to play over on YouTube.
Awesome. I love it. I feel like YouTube is a space where people go when they want to learn things as opposed to
Yeah,
some of the other social outlets. So I think this is a great start for you. And we will link your channel and your website and everything down below. So if anyone tuning in wants to connect with Dr. Sandal, learn from him, be a patient of his, we'll link that for you. And again, thank you so much for taking the time today. And until next week, wishing us all vibrant health and wellness.
Melissa, Emmie, thank you very much. Let's do it again sometime.
Of course.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for being here today. Don't forget to leave us a review and subscribe so we can continue to pay it forward together. And remember, the key to longevity is knowledge. Keep learning, growing, and tuning in to the Vibrant Wellness podcast to discover the latest insights and strategies for optimal health. Join us again next week. Just a reminder, this podcast is for educational and informational purposes and is not a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. The views expressed by guest and host are their own and do not necessarily reflect the official policy of Vibrant Wellness. As always, consult your healthcare provider before applying any recommendations that you heard here today.